Hello, Keith Rucker here, VintageMachinery.org. Guys, today we're back working on the metal planer restoration, and we're going to be reassembling this shaft. We made this new shaft here in a previous set of videos, and we're going to put everything back together. Got a couple of gears on here, some bearings. We got a little clutch mechanism here for the feed, and we got to get all that put back together and all back on the machine. So let's get at it. So previously I've gone in and I've repainted all my parts. I've got everything cleaned up. I've got everything ready to go back together. Again, this is the shaft. We made a new one. The previous one, or the original one, I guess, was had some wear in it, had some unacceptable stuff going on with it. So we just turned a new one on the lathe. And now we're ready to start putting it back together. And the first thing I want to do is this large area in here. There's two gears, these two gears here that fit up on this, and I want to go ahead and get those in because that's kind of in the middle of the shaft and that's the most inaccessible place. So the big gear goes on the outside here. I've got a there's a keyway in here that locks this in place, so I'm going to get my keyway up. Take our shaft. This is when I pressed these out on the original one, they just really kind of slid out. It's just a nice snug fit. I'm just going to kind of set this right here for the moment. All right, so I took some measurements on how far these stuck out on either end. So let me get my measurements out here. All right, so we stuck out about 1 inch and 15/16 previously. That's back where we need to be. And the key on this is a wedge type key. It goes in and it just kind of wedges in place, and that holds this gear where it needs to be. Let me double check that measurement and make sure it didn't move. And we're right on the money. So now, put my smaller gear in here. The smaller gear, we need to be 1 1/8 in. I've got it in the correct position. Got my keyway here. And we'll knock her in. Just for clarification over here, I had said 1 inch and 15/16, so it was 1 1/8 on this side as well. So we've got both the gears now in position where they need to be. The keys are in, and you can see the keys kind of sticking in between the middle there. Between them, everything's just like it needs to be. Next step here is I'm going to go ahead and put my Babbitt bearing block on the end here, and that fits nice. Now this Babbitt material, I've talked about it before, it's just a tin and lead based metal that's poured in here to make a bearing. This was very common back before ball bearings became prevalent. It's a very good bearing material. It just requires that you keep it lubricated, you keep oil on it. And speaking of which, I'm going to go ahead and put some oil on this bearing just to start with, so that we have some lubrication in here. The shell just goes together. 2 bolts to tighten it up. And let's tighten these on up. I'm going to have to turn this around. I'm looking, and I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but these end caps aren't lining up. I've got that top bearing cover is on backwards, and it's hard to tell which way they go, but it only fits one direction. So we'll flip that around. There we go, that lines up better. Should have been paying attention to that, but I noticed it before we got done. Try this again. We'll tighten them on up now. All right, and that bearing is moving very nicely. It's not too loose by any means, so that's going to be just right. Moving on. Next, we got another bearing housing here. This one goes kind of in the middle a little bit, and same setup as before. Let's see, I'm going to put a little bit of oil in here. Bring that up. Make sure I have my alignment right this time with my bearing caps. Looks like that one's going to be just fine that way. Okay. Now, yeah, that fits just fine. So you can see this one here has a little tube that comes up. This is where you feed oil. It just goes down through the machine. And this little well here, this is actually an oil reservoir. Before I put this back on the machine, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pack this with some wool felt, some cotton lint, something like that, just something to kind of help hold that oil in there. That was very common, and that would basically kind of meter the oil, drip it down into the bearing rather than just having a liquid reservoir there. The oil would drip out too fast. Putting some type of material in there, a wick in there, actually will regulate that much better so that you get good oil contact. You don't want the oil going too fast. You just want it going fast enough to keep it lubricated, just a thin layer of oil. So anyway, we're moving along here. Let's continue on. Up next is this mechanism here that actually adjusts the length of the feed on the machine, and there's a worm and worm gear in here. It all has to go back together, a handle. So start by putting a little bit of oil in there. This casting here, there we go. That just rotates just like such. And we have the worm gear. This is the worm. Put a little oil on this shaft. All right, so those two work on each other to turn that around. Let's see here. I disengaged the worm from the worm gear here for right now until I get this assembled. There's a little pin that drops down right there, and this little piece fits up over it. There's a keyway in there that should ride right over that pin. There we go. And then there's a nut that screws up on here to adjust that. And that's about right there. We just want it to be tight enough where it'll turn easily and freely. And that does it right there. Then we have a hand wheel that comes on the end here. This hand wheel has a pin that goes down through it to hold it all together. This is not a tapered pin. This is just a straight pin. So it really doesn't matter which side goes in first in this situation. I've gone just a tad too far. There we go. Now, put a little bit of oil on this. That is mighty tight. We're going to have to make some adjustments somewhere because that is not wanting to work right. All right, let me play around with this and figure out what's going on. Well, there we go. It's working. The problem was down here on this end. It gets to a point and it gets real tight right in there. And I had to go put this in the vise and kind of get it past that point. Once it gets past that point, it works just fine. So anyway, no problem there. That is running nice and slick. That's exactly what we want. So this is ready to go back on the machine. So this just kind of fits right up on this shaft. And it just turns almost like a bearing surface. In fact, I guess you could say it is a bearing surface. There's no Babbitt in this. It just kind of hangs from the bottom of the machine and rotates on that cast iron surface. Let me get it lined up here. There we go. So next step here, need to get the clutch assembled and put back together and back on there. So this is the clutch mechanism. There's some places back here. This is where that little other piece we just put in with the worm that has the adjustable dog. This is one of these stops here is what hits that, and that adjusts this. It basically rotates around, but it's got a limited travel. So, got this. Let's see, we got a leather disc that goes in here. This is basically your little clutch mechanism. There's a steel plate in between them, another leather disc, and then we put the cover on. And hang on, I got to find my witness marks as to where this goes back together. Give me just a sec. All right, it goes on like this. There's two pins that align it right there. And then we got 4 of these bolts that go down on here. This mechanism, as you can see, may be able to see in the video, this mechanism that you may be able to read it in the video there is patented February 13th, 1883 by Albert Bean. I actually have a copy of the patent that we were able to find. So let me put this back together. All right, and I believe that this is ready to go back on over there. I think we're ready to reassemble this. First thing I want to do is put my key back in. Get a hammer, tap that down in there. This should slide right up on there. That's back up on there now. I'm ready to put our nut here on the end. And I have my big ratchet to tighten this up with. Socket. What was this? This was a 2 3/4 inch socket, and I was just fortunate that they had one that size at the museum to put on here. All right. And with that, I think we are ready to put all this back on the planer. All right, so I think we're about ready to put all this on, and the first thing I want to do is just get some packing to go in these bearings. This is just some cotton waste. Came out of an old cotton mill. Stuff's getting kind of hard to find because there's not many cotton mills left around. Down here in the South, every little town used to have cotton mills in them, but most of that, like everything else, seems like it's moved overseas. So Anyway, I'm going to put some of that down in there. That's just going to act as some wicking. We'll go ahead and squirt a little oil in there with it. That reservoir will fill up with oil over time. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, get all the packing done, and then we can hoist this thing up and get ready to start putting it in, hopefully. All right, putting some more oil wick material down this bearing shell. This one has that tube just running up in there. I've been having to guide this bearing up in here to get that to line up, and we got a little bit of packing that goes in right here as well. Maybe a little bit too much. Got some packing there. And I'm going to just kind of hoist this the rest of the way up, hopefully. I think we got it pretty well lined up now and ready to go in. I am using some anti-seize on these bolts to make sure they don't get stuck in here. This is some copper anti-seize made by CRC, and we're just going to put a little bit on the tip of each bolt before we put it in there, and that'll make it where these things won't rust in place. And Lord forbid if anybody else ever has to take this thing apart, it'll be a little bit easier on them. Nice thing about this anti-seize is that it also serves as a lubricant for when these bolts are going in, which makes them hopefully spin in a little bit easier as well. Had that one just kind of stuck in there holding it in place. Let me get some anti-seize on there and put it all the way up in there now. So I think we got it back together. So just letting you see what's happening. Of course, this big bull gear is what drives the table back and forth. There's a rack up underneath it that engages it. This is the last gear in here. And there's, of course, we got a reducing shaft here. There's the big gears here that goes to another small gear that goes to a big gear, and so on and so on. So you have the drive pulleys that is reducing the speed of the motion all the way up to this. Now I'm going to just turn this one because I can. And you can see the rack's turning when it's going in that direction. Then when it goes back, see that little clutch mechanism on the side? It rotated. And you can adjust this with the stop down here as far as how far that will rotate on each turn. And that rocking motion over here is what's going to make our feed go in and out. Which you'll see how that works later on. But bottom line is we got this shaft on here. Everything seems to be working good. And we're ready to move on to the next part on this coming up soon. Well, there you go, guys. That's going to be a wrap on this episode. We got one more of our shafts in, making progress on getting this whole gear chain in. That's kind of my first big step here, is to get all that mounted up under the bottom and get all of that working before we really start trying to level the machine and move on to getting things scraped in. So I want to get all that weight that's going to be up under the bottom kind of on here because that could affect some alignment issues later on. I will comment, though, that we did move the machine. I've made the decision that where I'm going to put it, I'm going to put it kind of back here in the back side of the shop. My plan is I'm going to probably put a line shaft in here and actually run this off of a line shaft. I think that'll be cool. I could put just a motor on it, but hey, why not do it the way it was originally set up? I just think that's neat. I've always wanted to have a line shaft, and I got several machines that we can run off of that as well. So that's going to kind of be my plan there. So I moved it back here, and a big reason I did that is I want to set it up and put it where it's going to be, get it all leveled up, get it scraped in, where it's going to be sitting at, rather than doing it in one spot and having to move it, which was kind of my original plan. But as I thought about that, I just felt it'd be a lot wiser just go ahead and put it where it's going to be and not have to worry about that added layer of complexity to things. So anyway, that's where we're at now. More work on this later on. We'll continue working on that drive shaft and the drive train until we get it all hooked up. Well, guys, that's going to be it. As always, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave me a thumbs up. Those are appreciated, and comments are always appreciated as well. We'll see you now on the next video.